Negotiating. Negotiation Mistakes and Mediation Skills for Beginners. Written by Tom Hendricks. Narrated by Doug Green. Chapter 1. Mediation Skills. Mediation is the participation of an impartial third party to support and help those involved in a conflict to find a resolution. The key difference between negotiation and mediation is that in negotiation, the parties included work out their own agreement. In mediation, they have the support of the third party, the mediator, to help them come to a contract. Mediation, whether official or informal, can often help resolve disputes that have exceeded the negotiation stage. Characteristics of mediation. An important element of mediation is that the arbitrator does not sort things out or make any decisions for the parties involved. Rather, he or she helps the parties involved collaborate to develop their own agreement. Mediation involves voluntary participation, face-to-face discussions between the parties in dispute, an impartial mediator with no decision-making power who helps those involved to comprehend each other's point of view and come to a contract, equal opportunities for all individuals to speak and explain their perspective, all relevant information being shared, a shared arrangement between the parties. Although there are many trained mediators working to resolve conflicts, anyone can function as a conciliator, whether in a dispute between co-workers or to bring two quarreling friends or neighbors together again. The mediation process. Although each conflict and every mediation process will be somewhat different, there are some steps which you're going to really need to consider in every case and points to take into consideration. 1. Preparation. You will need to set out the guideline for the mediation process. Usually some fundamental guidelines of communication and confidentiality will be essential, but there might also be others significant to that circumstance. For example, you may want to set out that only one individual talks at a time, and while a person is talking, the others listen in silence, that there is to be no verbal abuse at any time, and that all that takes place stays private unless both parties accept discussing it outside mediation. You could also wish to set out the arbitrator's role, to be objective and help the parties to reach their solution, but also to protect the parties from one another if necessary. In addition, you should think about whether you should have separate meetings with each party to develop a much better grasp of the concerns before mediating a joint meeting. 2. Rebuilding and understanding the dispute. Your task at this stage is to listen to the participants' stories, whether together or individually, and clarify what they want to attain from the process. If you are meeting both participants together, it is helpful if you can sum up the bottom lines of dispute in a neutral way that both can concur upon and propose a program for the discussion, an order in which issues should be talked about. It can also be helpful at this stage to name the emotions that participants are feeling to show that they have been recognized and comprehended. 3. Specifying points of agreement and conflict. At the time of this stage, your role is to help the individuals to move to a position where they begin to comprehend each other's perspective and can then start to fix a shared issue. One way to do this is to think of it as moving from a focus on the past to one on the future. It can also be valuable to use restating and summary in neutral terms to help the individuals identify parts of arrangement and to check understanding. It's exceptionally effective to reflect feelings back to the participants, as it shows both that they have been heard. Do not be scared to suggest a break for coffee or a walk outside, or perhaps an adjournment to another day if you think things are getting a bit heated. Time out is an important reflection opportunity for everybody. 4. Creating choices for agreement. A useful beginning point for this stage is to identify the simplest area, or the one on which there is most agreement, and suggest dealing with that first to give a fast win. Beneficial techniques for developing alternatives include brainstorming, At this stage, anything goes. You then really need to help the individuals to develop assessment criteria, which should ideally be unbiased and in order of significance. Your role here is chiefly to make certain that all individuals are equally associated with producing choices and developing evaluation requirements, and that they cover all parts of the issue. Make certain that you are showing their opinions and not your own, but you can mention linkages between options and/or issues. And when the choices have been examined, you'll need to guide them to a single solution that suits all parties and help them to fine-tune it if needed. 5. Developing a contract. Like goals, a contract must be specific, quantifiable, obtainable, reasonable, and time-bound. You can help the participants to achieve this by jotting down the proposal in neutral language and reading it back to them. Jotting down individual points so they are clear and comprehended. Explaining some vague points, for instance, by asking the participants to concur concrete behavioral changes with due dates for achievement. Keep from legalistic language and keep every little thing simple. Summarize progress and next steps, including but not limited to setting a due date for any future meetings and recognizing any remaining parts of difficulty and options for their resolution. Being positive about development and the fact that everyone has stayed engaged. Offering your continued support as a conciliator if needed. Guaranteeing both parties sign the contract then and there, and close the meeting once arrangement is reached. Abilities mediators need. A mediator needs a range of abilities including active listening skills, questioning and clarifying skills to grasp both the facts and the parts of debate, emotional intelligence to comprehend the underlying emotions, summing up skills to set out the bottom lines of debate and underlying feelings, and also to help the participants to reframe concerns in less emotive language. Empathy to help each party to stand in each other's shoes and understand each other's perspective. Maybe what's most important is that an arbitrator must not take sides or be seen to be acting unfairly. You will thus really need to acknowledge points made by both parties and spend equal time with everyone or on their concerns. It's never going to help to explain that somebody is being unreasonable, and yet you can help these people take a reality check by asking what they would consider a sensible result, and after that, asking whether they think the other party would agree. Although a little humbleness is always an advantage, it is necessary to recall that mediation may not always work, and that it's not always the fault of the arbitrator if it does not. For example, if participants do not come prepared to find a shared resolution, it is going to be tough to moderate one. Cross-cultural disputes are always going to be hard to moderate, because what is acceptable behavior in one society might be completely undesirable in another. A great mediator will always try to be knowledgeable about what else is going on, attempting to understand any hidden agendas and barriers to reliable problem solving. A reliable conciliator will, at the same time, have the ability to distance themselves from the problem. The most crucial part of the mediator is to help others solve their issues in a mutually acceptable way without getting bogged down in the issue themselves. Chapter 2. Making a decision. In its simplest sense, decision-making is the act of choosing between two or more strategies. In the wider process of problem-solving, decision-making includes choosing between possible options to a problem. Decisions can be made through either a user-friendly or reasoned process, or a mix of the two. Intuition. Intuition is using your gut feeling about possible courses of action. Although people talk about it as if it was a magical sense, intuition is actually a mix of past experience and your personal values. It is worth taking your intuition into account just because it reflects your finding out about life. It is, however, not always based on reality, only your perceptions, a lot of which might have begun in childhood and might not be very mature as a result. It is for that reason worth analyzing your suspicion carefully, particularly if you have a really strong feeling against a specific strategy, to see if you can work out why and whether the inner feeling is justified. Thinking. Thinking is using the facts and figures in front of you to make choices. Reasoning has its roots in the here and now and in simple facts. It can, however, overlook emotional elements to the choice, and in particular, concerns from the past that could influence the manner in which the choice is implemented. Intuition is a completely acceptable means of deciding, although it is normally more appropriate when the decision is of a basic nature or needs to be made rapidly. More complex decisions tend to need a more formal, systemized method, typically involving both intuition and thinking. It is essential to be careful of spontaneous responses to a situation. Applying both reason and intuitive senses. One way to do this is to apply the two aspects in turn. It's useful to begin with reason and gather facts and figures, and once you have an obvious choice, it's the turn of intuition. How do you feel about the answer? Does it feel like it's okay? If not, have another look at it and see if you can work out why not. If you're not emotionally committed to the choice you have made, you will not implement it well or successfully. Effective decision-making. Decisions really need to be capable of being carried out, whether on an individual or organizational level. You do, therefore, really need to be committed to the decision personally, and be able to convince others of its merits. An efficient decision-making process, because of this, needs to ensure that you are able to do so. What can prevent efficient decision-making? There are a number of problems that can prevent reliable decision-making. Those include 1. Insufficient info. If you do not have enough info, it can feel like you are deciding with no basis. Take a little bit of time to gather the needed information to inform your decision, even if the time scale is extremely tight. If necessary, prioritize your information gathering by recognizing which info will be most important to you. 2. Too much info. The opposite issue, but one that is seen remarkably typically. Having so much contrasting information that it is unrealistic to see the wood for the trees. This is in some cases called analysis paralysis and is also used as a method to postpone organizational decision-making, with those included demanding ever more information before they can decide. This issue can often be solved by getting everyone together to choose what info is really important and why, and by setting a clear time scale for decision-making, which includes an information gathering stage. 3. Too many people. Making decisions by committee is hard. Everyone has their own views and their own values, and while it's important to know what these views are and why and how they are necessary, it could be important for a single person to take responsibility for deciding. Sometimes, any decision is better than none. 4. Vested interests. Decision-making procedures typically happen under the weight of vested interests. These beneficial interests are often not overtly expressed, but may be a vital obstruction. Simply because they aren't overtly expressed, it is hard to recognize them plainly, and for that reason address them, but it can sometimes be possible to do so by exploring them with somebody outside the process, but in a comparable position. It can also be good to explore the rational or intuitive elements with all stakeholders, typically with an external facilitator to support the process. 5. Psychological attachments. People are often very connected to the status quo. Choices tend to include the prospect of change, which lots of people find hard. 6. No emotional attachment. In some cases, it is tough to decide because you just don't care one way or the other. In this case, a structured decision-making process can typically help by determining some really masters and cons of specific actions that perhaps you had not thought about before. Tons of these issues can be gotten rid of by utilizing an organized decision-making process, This will help to minimize more complex choices down to easier steps. See how any choices are gotten to, and plan choice making to meet deadlines. Many different methods of choice making have been developed, varying from simple rules of thumb to incredibly complex procedures. The approach used depends on the nature of the decision to be made and how complicated it is. Chapter 3. Clarifying and Information. In communication, clarification includes offering back to the speaker the vital meaning, as comprehended by the listener, of what they have just said, and therefore, checking that the listener's understanding is right and resolving any parts of confusion or misunderstanding. Explanation is necessary in many situations, particularly when what is being communicated is hard in some way. Communication can be difficult for lots of reasons. Perhaps sensitive emotions are being talked about, or you are listening to some complicated info or following guidelines. The goal of information is to ensure that the listener's understanding of what the speaker has said is right, minimizing misconception. Assure the speaker that the listener is truly fascinated by them and is trying to understand what they are saying. As an extension of showing, clarifying reassures the speaker that the listener is trying to understand the messages they are expressing. Clarifying can involve asking questions or periodically summarizing what the speaker has said. A listener can ask for explanation when they can't understand the speaker's reactions. In some cases, the messages that a speaker is trying to send can be highly intricate, involving various people, concerns, spots, and/or times. Clarifying helps you to sort these out, and also to check the speaker's concerns. Through clarification, it is possible for the speaker and the listener to make sense of these typically confused and intricate concerns. Clarifying involves genuineness on the listener's part, and it shows speakers that the listener is interested in them and in what they need to say. Some examples of non-directive, clarification-seeking questions are: I'm not rather sure I understand what you are saying. I don't feel clear about the primary issue here. When you said, what did you mean? Could you repeat? Clarifying involves non-judgmental questioning, summarizing and looking for feedback as to its precision. Clarification questions. When you are the listener in a sensitive environment, the right sort of non-directive questioning can make it possible for the speaker to define their viewpoint more totally. Asking the best question at the correct time can be crucial and includes practice. The best questions are open-ended as they give the speaker choice in how to react, although closed questions allow only extremely limited reactions. Open questions. If your role is to assist a speaker to speak about a concern, usually the most efficient questioning starts with when, where, how, or why. These questions motivate speakers to be open and go deeper into their thoughts. For instance, when did you first start feeling like this? Why do you feel this way? Closed questions. Closed questions usually generate a yes or no response and don't motivate speakers to be open and expand on their thoughts. Such questions often start with "did you?" or "were you?" For example, did you always feel like this? Were you aware of feeling this way? Standards for clarifying. Explanation is the ability we use to guarantee that we have understood the message of the speaker in a social exchange. When using explanation, follow these standards to help aid communication and understanding. Admit if you're unsure about what the speaker is actually saying. Ask for repeating. State what the speaker has said as you comprehend it and check whether this is what they truly said. Ask for particular examples. Use open, non-directive questions if proper. Ask if you have got it right and be prepared to be fixed. Summing up. As a further extension to explanation, A summary involves evaluating what has happened during the whole conversation. It is important to keep only to the important components of the discussion, and it must be given from the speaker's context, not an interpretation from the listener's perspective. The aim of a synopsis is to examine understanding, not to give clarification, to judge, to interpret, or supply solutions. Summing up should be done at the end of a discussion, though at times it may be proper midway through, as a way of accumulating different threads. At the start of a discussion, it is helpful to summarize any prior discussions or conferences, as it can help to provide focus, whilst the summary is likely to be the longest time a listener will be speaking throughout a discussion. It is important to be as succinct and simple as possible. In reflection, clarifying, and summarizing, speakers must be enabled to disagree with and correct what the listener says. They should be encouraged to show themselves again, if needed, giving the listener another chance at understanding, and to check understanding until contract is reached. Reflecting, clarifying, and summing up are the tools used by active listeners to enable them to demonstrate understanding and motivate a speaker to talk honestly. For reliable communication, it is important that the listener and speaker both have the exact same grasp of the discussion. The speaker must, for this reason, have the chance to fix the listener's understanding. Use information, reflection, and summing up to help with your social relationships. Chapter 4. The 5 Negotiation Mistakes to Stay Away From. Whether you're negotiating your income at a new job, asking for a pay raise, or overseeing a business offer, negotiation is a skill that each professional needs, but it's no easy feat. It can take a long period of time to reach an agreement no matter what you're negotiating for, and ultimately you may not even get what you want. That's why it's important to make certain you do everything the right way. Even the tiniest errors can cost you success. 1. Don't make assumptions. The key to a successful negotiation is being prepared, and that means a lot more than knowing numbers and facts. Quote, "Failing to prepare is preparing to struggle," Fletcher said. Quote, "Preparation means event and comprehending the hard data, for example, your comparables, but it also means having 360-degree awareness. That suggests that you really need to know who the choice maker is and what the other party's needs, values, hopes, and fears are," Fletcher said. It also means not assuming that anything is non-negotiable ahead of time. Quote, "Gather as much information as you can beforehand and be prepared to ask strong diagnostic questions to gain clarity," she said. There is rarely a clear roadmap within a negotiation. The more ready you are, Fletcher said, the better you will be able to navigate the negotiation. 2. Do not rush. Negotiations take some time, specifically if you want them to go smoothly. Put in the time to establish a very real relationship with the other party, Fletcher advised. Quote, "Share a little piece of personal info that indicates your openness and desire for connection," she said. Doing so can move a negotiation from an adversarial fight to an efficient discussion. And don't be afraid to build in pauses, as they can help everyone regain perspective and get rid of excessive feelings, Fletcher said. Quote, "A negotiation does not need to happen all at once," she said. 3. Do not take anything personally. Fletcher noted that it can be easy to let your feelings overcome you at the time of a negotiation, especially if it's something that affects you. But look out, getting too psychological will hurt your performance, she said. Her guidance for making it through unharmed? Quote, "Challenge yourself to turn moment where you feel attacked and defensive into moment of interest where you can get feedback. Feeling can easily be used against you in a deal." Fletcher also said knowing your psychological triggers and knowing how to draw back when you feel things moving in the wrong direction. 4. Don't accept a bad offer. Negotiation can be a long, tiring, and demanding activity, Fletcher said. It can be easy to settle, but agreeing to a deal just to get a deal is not good, no matter what side you're on. Quote, "It's important to remember that a deal is not necessarily better than no offer," she said. "That can be discouraging when you have invested energy and time into getting a deal done, but it is necessary to have that clarity." Fletcher said you should understand entering into the negotiation exactly what you want to give up and what you aren't. Ask yourself, what does success look like? At what point am I comfortable walking away? Eventually, not making a deal needs to always be a choice. 5. Don't over-negotiate. If you are fortunate enough to have the upper hand throughout the negotiation, don't take advantage of it way too much, Fletcher said. Think of the effects of over-negotiating ahead of time, she said. You might get what you want, but at what price? Quote, "Don't put yourself in a position where you can't return to a relationship because you over-leveraged," Fletcher said. Recognize that ideally, this is a relationship and a discussion that will continue in time. What are some examples of negotiating? Though there's no such thing as a foolproof negotiation approach, some strategies are better than others. Here are several of examples of good negotiation techniques. Understanding how to close the deal while adding value. Rather than selling yourself short and just taking whatever deal you can get, try to add value to the offer. For example, if you are selling cable television packages, you might be happy just to get someone to agree to subscribe to the service. However, a seasoned negotiator will go above and beyond by offering premium channels, upgraded equipment, and more. Moreover, these add-ons will be better received if you can include a discount that makes the client feel like they are getting more for their cash. Down-talking the service or product. If you include a lot of negatives in your settlements, you are going to frighten consumers away. An example would be the following. If you are selling cable television packages and a consumer makes a comment that the price is much higher than expected, the absolute worst thing you can do is agree with them. If a client is giving you their concentrated attention, they likely want you to convince them to buy your service and products. Though by agreeing that it costs too much, you are just affirming that the service is not worth the cash. On the other hand, if you counter this argument with something along the lines of, "It could look like a lot, but with all of the channels you're getting, we're basically losing cash." Or, "Yes, some customers say that, but we do provide a bulk discount rate that makes it a lot more budget-friendly than it seems," you'll be far more likely to secure the offer. Chapter 5. Control the negotiation before it starts. Countless books and articles give us guidance that can help deal makers keep from errors at the bargaining table. Nevertheless, some of the costliest mistakes take place before mediators even take a seat to talk about the essence of the offer. That is simply because people fall victim to an apparently sensible, but ultimately malfunctioning, assumption about deal-making. Negotiators often take it for granted that if they bring a lot of value to the table and have adequate leverage, they will have the ability to strike a great deal. While those things are certainly essential, many other elements impact where each party ends up. Here I make use of my experience advising scores of businesses on offers worth millions or billions of dollars to present 4 elements that can have a remarkable impact on negotiation outcomes. In every case, I provide guidance on what mediators should do before either side starts making offers or counter-offers. 1. Negotiate process prior to compound. Several years ago, 2 co-founders of a tech venture walked into a meeting with the CEO of a Fortune 100 company who had consented to invest $10 million with them. A week earlier, the parties had hammered out the financial investment amount and valuation, so the meeting was supposed to be celebratory more than anything else. When the co-founders went into the room, they were amazed to see a group of lawyers and bankers. The CEO was there too, but it quickly became clear that he was not going to actively participate. As fast as the co-founders took a seat, the lenders on the other side started to renegotiate the deal. The $10 million financial investment was still on the table, yet now they demanded a much lower evaluation. Simply put, the co-founders would need to forfeit substantially more equity. Their attempts to clarify that a contract had already been reached were without results. What was going on? Had the co-founders misconstrued the level of commitment in the prior meeting? Had they overlooked steps associated with settling the deal? Had the CEO intended to renege all along? Or had his team persuaded him that the deal could be sweetened? Upset and confused, the co-founders rapidly evaluated their choices. Accepting the new offer would hurt financially and emotionally, but they'd get the $10 million in needed funds. Meanwhile, doing so would considerably underestimate what they brought to the table. They decided to walk out without a deal. Right before they left, they emphasized their strong desire to do a deal on the preliminary terms and explained that this referred principle and also economics. Within hours, they were on an aircraft, not knowing what would happen. Some days later, the CEO called and accepted the original offer. The gutsy move worked out for the co-founders, but it would have been better not to let things go wrong in the first place. Their error was a common one, focusing way too much on the substance of the offer and insufficient on the process. Compound is the terms that make up the last agreement. Process is how you are going to get from where you are today to that contract. My guidance to deal makers? Negotiate the process before any substance. That's my rule. Consider another circumstance. You have actually been negotiating with a person for months. You have a few final concessions that you've been holding back. They're pricey but worth making if it will close the deal. With the finish line in sight, you make the concessions, and the opposite side responds, "This is great. I appreciate your versatility on these issues. Let me share this with my boss to see what she thinks." Sadly for you, you had no clue your counterpart even had a boss. You thought he was the decision maker. The settlements are obviously not over, and you have nothing left to give. The more clarity and dedication you have regarding the prospects, the less likely you are to make mistakes on substance. Negotiating process entails discussing and influencing a variety of aspects that will affect the result of the offer. Ask the other party, how much time does your firm really need to close the deal? Who has to be on board? What aspects might slow down or accelerate the process? Are there essential turning points or dates we should know? Remember to learn basic things such as, who will be in the meeting tomorrow? What will the agenda be? Since we are not going to talk about the problems of importance to us in the next meeting, when will we resolve them? Of course, you cannot always get clear answers to every question at the start, and at times it is premature to ask certain questions, but you should seek to clarify and reach arrangement on as many process elements as possible, and as early as is appropriate, to stay away from discovering substance later. 2. Normalize the process. An entrepreneur who owns several manufacturing facilities in Asia once told me that he no longer does business with businesses from the West unless their top supervisors want to first fly into his city to meet him. My initial thoughts were, is this about ego? Is it about building relationships? Is it a cultural standard or routine of some sort? Actually, none of those had anything to do with his prerequisite to signing a contract. Here is how he clarified it to me. Till they have flown into my city, and after that driven to our factory, which is located 20 kilometers from the airport but takes almost 3 hours to reach. Until they have experienced that, they just do not understand how things work around here. And if they do not comprehend, we run into serious problems. Because the first time there is a holdup or interruption, or if we need to renegotiate something, they will immediately presume we're either inexperienced or taking from them. And when they've seen how things actually work, we can have a more efficient relationship. Unless company partners comprehend what is normal in a given framework or culture, they are very likely to misconstrue or overreact to unfavorable events. The same is true in negotiations of all kinds. It is very important to normalize the process. If you have ever been associated with an awful dispute that entered into mediation, you might have seen this in action. When a very good arbitrator sits down with parties who are in a bitter disagreement, she might say something like, "You think you hate each other today? I can guarantee you about 3 days into this process, you're going to dislike each other a lot more. And when that happens, I want you to recall something. That's typical." If the arbitrator doesn't give this caution, the parties are a lot more likely to abandon the process when emotions increase and things seem to be breaking down. However, if she explains at the beginning that it is typical for things to get worse before they get much better, the parties are more likely to keep at it. By stabilizing the process, she efficiently manages their expectations. The exact same concept certainly applies to any negotiation where there's a danger that things will not go perfectly efficiently. If you expect delays or interruptions on your side, tell your counterparts. That allows you to shape how they will interpret an unfavorable event, should one occur, and to guarantee that they don't overweight its importance. You're going to have a much harder time attempting to impact their perceptions or win back their trust after something fails that they did not expect. Normalizing the process involves talking about, in advance, any elements that might cause the opposite side to question your intents or ability, or to doubt the probability of a successful result. You may explain common barriers that need to be gotten rid of, moment at the time of the process when it prevails for parties to feel restless or downhearted, events that might delay progress, and the distinction between disturbances that are commonplace and simple to deal with, and ones that are more serious. Motivate the other side to do the exact same for you. People typically are reluctant to go over what may go wrong because they're concentrated on providing themselves and the merits of the deal in the best possible light. That is especially true in certain societies and in contexts where competition is fierce. Your equivalent might be thinking, "Why should I talk about issues if my competitors are pretending things will be great?" That's reasonable. If other parties think that pointing out a potential disruption could cost them the business, or that you will use it as a lever to extract greater concessions, they are not likely to be honest. To encourage people to be open about problems, make it safe for them. Clarify that you are experienced enough to know that every offer and relationship is very likely to encounter troubles and disturbances, and that you want to discover more about the particular risk factors that might contribute in this case. And if you can indicate or commit to having no intent of holding those aspects against them, you have a much better chance of reaching an understanding that works for both sides. 3. Map out the negotiation space. Some years ago, a client of mine was preparing to sell his stake in a business that was jointly owned by 4 beings. The owners had been squabbling for several years. It was clear that the asset would really need to be combined under one party, or maybe 2 who could get along. It was also clear that nobody wanted to sell. Yet there was little choice in the matter, just because one of the owners, Business X, was a much bigger company with the power and the clout to push people out. It announced that it would purchase out the other 3. My client wanted to wait until Company X had bought out the other 2 owners before negotiating the sale of his shares. He figured that by being the last piece of the puzzle, he would have the ability to claim more money. When we met each other to discuss his strategy, I asked him to step back and plan out the negotiation space. This includes every party that can affect the negotiation, together with any party that will be impacted by the negotiation. In my experience, a technique that makes perfect sense when you're thinking bilaterally, that is, about the relationship between any 2 parties in the negotiation, can all of a sudden become inadequate and even disastrous when you take a multilateral perspective. I motivated my client to examine the interests, restrictions, options, and perspective of all of the appropriate parties. One of the important things we looked at was how much equity each party had and how much of the board everyone controlled. We then fixated on the interests of each company. What exactly are their interests in this offer? How would you rank their top priorities? The four parties had known one another a very long time, and my client did not have any trouble identifying what mattered most to each. Company X, for example, was concerned about three things, and its top priorities were as follows. 1. Track record. It didn't want ties with any company that could hurt its credibility. 2. Control. It really wanted ownership only in businesses where it had a majority of board seats. And 3. Money. It would want to pay as low as possible, but this was not as huge a concern as track record and control. After delving into the perspectives of all parties, we uncovered another important bit of info. Company A was the least fascinated by selling and was already arguing that could drag things out. When we put all of these specifics together, it ended up being clear that the last piece of the puzzle strategy would be risky. Why? For Company X, control was a higher top priority than cash. To get control, it needed to purchase either my client or Company A. As soon as it made either purchase, it would control more than 50% of the board seats, and thus the company, for most decisions. Because of this, if my client were the last to sell, he would be negotiating with Company X after it had control. At that time, my client would be able to make money only for his 1/6 share of the firm's equity. But if he were to sell first, at a time when Business A was refusing to sell and was making things hard for Business X, he could monetize two assets, his shares and his board seat. In other words, the last party to negotiate would have the least leverage and minimal chances to monetize its assets. In reality, you'll never ever have as complete a picture as you'd like, but you put yourself at more drawback if you focus too narrowly on the party on the other side of the table. You have to examine the perspective of all of the parties that can influence or are impacted by the offer. Who has the capability to influence the individual on the other side of the table? How might the technique or actions of other parties change your alternatives for better or even worse? How does the deal impact the interests of those that aren't at the table? How will this negotiation impact your leverage with future negotiation partners? If multiple parties are associated with the offer, does it make sense to negotiate with them all at once or in sequence, together or separately? Your analysis may suggest a significant change of strategy, that you should talk with a much different party first, delay the offer, or speed it up, bring others into the room, expand or contract the scope of the offer, etc. 4. Control the frame. The result of a negotiation depends a great deal on each side's leverage. The better your outside alternatives are and the more ways you have to reward or persuade the opposite side, the more likely you are to accomplish your objectives. However, the psychology of the offer can be just as crucial. In my experience, the frame or psychological lens through which the parties see the negotiation has a substantial effect on where they wind up. Are the parties treating the interaction as a problem-solving exercise or as a battle to be won? Are they looking at it as a meeting of equals, or do they view an important difference in status? Are they fixated on the long term or the short term? Are concessions expected, or are they seen as signs of weakness? Reliable mediators will try to control or change the frame early in the process, preferably before the substance of the deal is even discussed. Here are 3 components of framing that mediators would be wise to consider. Value versus cost. I have worked with many innovation firms whose innovative products offer tremendous value for consumers but are priced substantially higher than what their competitors are charging, or what customers are paying for their tradition systems. While the high price is justified by the value proposition, salespeople usually face instant resistance when a prospective consumer learns that the cost will be 5 or 10 times the amount he's currently paying. Too frequently, the sales representative will hear something like, "You are charging 5 times what others charge. Nobody pays that much for this type of thing." One of the most typical mistakes salespeople make in those situations, without even realizing it, is to say sorry for having a high cost. They do this when they say, "I understand it's costly, but," or when they quickly signify a determination to change the cost. My advice? Always validate your offer, but never ever say sorry for it. When you apologize, you signal that even you do not think the price is appropriate, and you give the opposite side license to bargain. The whole frame of the negotiation ends up being about cost, when what you really want to go over is value. A much better reaction would be, what you are probably asking is, how is it that despite a higher price, we still have a long and growing list of customers? We both know that no one will pay more for something than it deserves, so let's talk about the value we bring so that you can choose what's best for you. In settlements of all kinds, the faster you can shift the conversation away from the cost to your counterpart and fixate on the value you bring to the table, the more likely it is that you will be able to monetize that value. Your options versus theirs. Research and experience suggest that people who walk into a deal consumed by the question, "What will happen to me if there is no offer?" become worse outcomes than the ones who fixate on, "What would happen to the opposite side if there is no offer?" When you are extremely concerned with your own options, and especially when your outside options are weak, you think concerning, "What will it take at a minimum to get them to say yes?" And once you make the deal about what happens to them if there's no offer, you move the frame to the unique value you offer, and it ends up being easier to validate why you are worthy of a good deal. Equality versus dominance. Not so long ago, I was seeking advice from on a tactical handle, which our side was a little, early-stage company and the other was a very large international. One of the most important things we did throughout the process, and especially at the outset, was make sure the difference in company size did not frame the negotiation. I told our team, "These folks talk with two sorts of businesses, those they consider their equates to, and those they think should feel fortunate just to be at the table with them. And they treat the two kinds differently, regardless of what they take to the table." Throughout the years, I have seen many big organizations impose demands on their perceived inferiors that they'd never ever require from those they considered equals. In this negotiation, I wanted to make sure our counterpart treated us like equals. To keep the supremacy frame from taking hold, we began forming expectations and perceptions at the very start, before we even considered the economics of the offer. This is an example. At any time, our equivalent made a procedural need, nevertheless little, that we felt they would not have made from an equal, we respectfully pushed all the way back on it. Whenever they included an arrangement in the term sheet that seemed one-sided, even if it wouldn't have been a costly concession, we redrafted it to be symmetrical. And throughout the negotiation, we ensured they understood that though our firm was much littler, we were equals in this negotiation because of the tremendous value we offered. While I am not an advocate of nitpicking on minor concerns, in this case we did so intentionally to help set the right frame. Mediators can form the frame in many other ways and on many other dimensions. At the very least, you want to guarantee that the psychological lens that takes hold respects the value you take to the table. In The Art of War, Sun Tzu posits that each war is won or lost before it even begins. There is truth to this belief in most tactical interactions. While it would be risky for negotiators to minimize the importance of thoroughly managing the substance of a deal, they should strive to avoid the mistakes that can occur before anybody has even created an offer. By focusing on the 4 factors discussed here, you increase your chances of creating more productive interactions and attaining more profitable outcomes. This has been Negotiating. Negotiation Mistakes and Mediation Skills for Beginners. Written by Tom Hendricks. Narrated by Doug Green.